What happens when a groundbreaking TV show, celebrated for its bold storytelling and cultural impact, crosses a line that some believe should never be crossed? Could one single moment, a single scene, derail over a decade of success and redefine how we remember a television classic? These are the questions that haunt The Jeffersons, a sitcom that wasn't just entertainment, but a cultural milestone. For 11 seasons, George and Louise Jefferson charmed audiences with their wit, ambition, and unapologetic approach to tackling sensitive issues. But what led to the infamous moment that changed everything? Was it an inevitable clash between creative ambition and societal expectations? Or did deeper tensions behind the scenes push the show to its breaking point? Most importantly, how does this moment fit into the legacy of one of television's most iconic families? Let's take a closer look at the Jeffersons' rise to greatness, the storm that followed, and the enduring impact of a show that dared to challenge the status quo. In the early 1970s, television was undergoing a seismic shift. Shows like All in the Family, created by Norman Lear, were introducing complex social themes wrapped in the familiar package of sitcom humor. It was in this environment that the Jefferson family first made their appearance. George and Louise, affectionately nicknamed Wheezy, were not initially the stars of the show. Instead, they were supporting characters introduced to highlight the racial tensions and class divides of the time. Their debut episode, Lionel Moves into the Neighborhood, aired in 1971. In this All in the Family episode, the Jeffersons moved into a working-class, predominantly white neighborhood in Queens, right next door to Archie and Edith Bunker. George Jefferson, played by Sherman Hemsley, and Louise, portrayed by Isabel Sanford, were designed to challenge and counterbalance the outspoken and bigoted Archie Bunker. Lionel, their son, had already made an appearance in the show's pilot, paving the way for the family's eventual expansion into its own storyline. From the beginning, George Jefferson was unlike any other African-American character on television. He was loud, opinionated, and unafraid to stand his ground, even against the abrasive Archie. This was by design. Norman Lear wanted to create a character who wasn't subservient, who could take on the Archies of the world and hold his own. Louise Jefferson, in contrast, was the voice of reason, a calming presence who balanced George's fiery temperament. Together, they represented a new type of black family on television, proud, ambitious, and unapologetically themselves. But George's arrival on the show was delayed. Sherman Hemsley was Norman Lear's first choice for the role, but Hemsley was tied up in a Broadway production at the time. Rather than recast the character, Lear created George's younger brother Henry as a temporary stand-in. It wasn't until the 1973 episode Henry's Farewell that Hemsley finally stepped into George's shoes, instantly making the role his own. As the Jeffersons became more prominent in All in the Family, Lear saw an opportunity to explore their story further. He had been inspired by a meeting with members of the Black Panther Party, who had pointed out that black characters on television were often depicted as struggling or subservient. They wanted to see a portrayal of success, a family that had moved on up. This conversation planted the seed for what would become The Jeffersons. When the show premiered in January 1975, it was immediately clear that this was something new. The Jeffersons flipped the script on traditional portrayals of African-American families, showcasing George and Louise as successful business owners living in a luxurious Manhattan apartment. Their move from Queens to Manhattan wasn't just a geographical shift. It was symbolic of their climb up the social ladder. George's dry cleaning business had grown from a single store into a thriving chain, making him the epitome of the self-made man. The show's premise was as aspirational as it was comedic, and audiences responded enthusiastically. The Jeffersons were funny, relatable, and refreshingly bold, unafraid to tackle issues like racism, classism, and interracial marriage head-on. Louise's warmth and wisdom, George's larger-than-life personality, and their interactions with neighbors like Tom and Helen Willis, an interracial couple, made the show both entertaining and socially significant. Despite its groundbreaking nature, The Jeffersons wasn't without its challenges. Early on, there were concerns from network executives about how George Jefferson's brash demeanor would be received by viewers. Sherman Hemsley himself faced criticism for leaning too heavily into George's abrasiveness, but he believed the character needed to be authentic, even if that meant ruffling feathers. This tension between creative vision and audience reception would become a recurring theme throughout the show's run. By the late 1970s, The Jeffersons had cemented its place as a cultural touchstone. It consistently ranked high in the Nielsen ratings, with its humor and heart resonating across racial and generational lines. The show's ability to blend comedy with social commentary was its hallmark, and its willingness to push boundaries set it apart from other sitcoms of the era. However, this willingness to push boundaries also sowed the seeds of its eventual downfall. As the 1980s approached, the cultural landscape was shifting. Audiences were becoming more conservative, and networks were increasingly wary of controversy. While the Jeffersons continued to tackle important issues, it did so against a backdrop of growing tension between the show's creators, its cast, and the network. This tension reached its peak in the early 1980s, leading to a pivotal moment that would change everything. But at the height of its success, few could have predicted the storm that lay ahead. For now, George and Wheezy were still riding high, and The Jeffersons remained one of the most beloved shows on television. As The Jeffersons moved into its later seasons, the show continued to gain momentum, becoming a household name across America. George and Louise Jefferson's journey from Queens to Manhattan wasn't just an entertaining narrative, it was a cultural statement. Their success symbolized the possibilities of upward mobility in a society still grappling with racial and economic divides. But with success came scrutiny, and the show's bold approach to social commentary often put it in the spotlight, for better or worse. By the late 1970s, The Jeffersons had become known for its ability to balance humor with hard-hitting truths. It tackled topics that other sitcoms shied away from, including racism, sexism, and even the taboo subject of interracial relationships. The dynamic between George Jefferson and his neighbors Tom and Helen Willis became a central point of both comedy and conflict. George's frequent jabs at their interracial marriage, calling them zebras or mixed nuts, reflected his discomfort and biases. Yet the show used these moments to spark deeper conversations about acceptance and prejudice, often delivering a poignant lesson by the end of the episode. This nuanced approach wasn't limited to George's relationships with his neighbors. Within the Jefferson household, generational and ideological clashes were often explored through Lionel, George and Louise's son, and his wife, Jenny. Their marriage represented a new era of integration and progress, but it also highlighted the lingering challenges of bridging cultural divides. Episodes that centered on their family dynamics often struck a chord with viewers, who saw their own struggles mirrored in the Jeffersons' experiences. The 1970s and early 1980s were a transformative period for television. Shows like The Jeffersons were pushing boundaries, but they were also navigating an increasingly complex media landscape. While the show enjoyed critical and commercial success, it wasn't without its controversies. Some viewers felt that George Jefferson's brash personality was too abrasive, while others criticized the show for leaning too heavily on stereotypes. Norman Lear and the creative team defended these choices, arguing that George's larger-than-life persona was essential to the show's impact. Behind the scenes, tensions were mounting. Sherman Hemsley, who played George Jefferson, was deeply committed to the role, but he also felt strongly about how the character was portrayed. As the show progressed, he began pushing back against scripts that relied on offensive language or outdated tropes. Hemsley believed that the Jeffersons had a responsibility to evolve, reflecting the progress it championed. His efforts were met with resistance from the network and even some members of the writing team, who feared that softening George's character would dilute the show's edge. This push-and-pull dynamic extended beyond Hemsley. Isabel Sanford, who played Louise Jefferson, often found herself in the role of mediator. Sanford's portrayal of Louise was beloved for her warmth and wisdom, and she shared a similar desire for the show to remain authentic. However, she also recognized the delicate balance between addressing social issues and maintaining the comedic tone that audiences had come to expect. Despite these challenges, the show thrived during this period. It regularly ranked among the top programs on television, with millions tuning in each week to see the Jeffersons navigate their ever-changing world. The characters had become cultural icons, and the show's theme song, "Movin' On Up," was practically a national anthem for anyone chasing the American dream. Florence Johnston, the Jeffersons' sassy housekeeper played by Marla Gibbs, became a fan favorite, and her witty banter with George provided some of the show's most memorable moments. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The network, while supportive of the show's success, was growing increasingly wary of its more controversial storylines. Television in the early 1980s was becoming more conservative, reflecting broader cultural shifts in America. Viewers were still drawn to the Jeffersons, but the topics it tackled were starting to feel like risky territory for advertisers and executives. The creative team behind the show faced a growing dilemma. How could they continue to push boundaries without alienating their audience or the network? This question became increasingly difficult to answer as the show entered its later seasons. Episodes addressing issues like police brutality, systemic racism, and economic inequality were met with mixed reactions. For some, these storylines were a bold and necessary reflection of reality. For others, they felt too heavy-handed for a sitcom. The tension reached a boiling point in the early 1980s when discussions began about a particularly contentious storyline. It was a concept that promised to be groundbreaking, but also carried the risk of polarizing viewers and angering the network. The creative team debated fiercely, weighing the potential impact against the inevitable backlash. For Sherman Hemsley, the decision was clear. The show had to stay true to its roots, even if it meant taking a risk. For the network, the stakes were higher. With advertising dollars on the line, CBS was reluctant to greenlight anything that might jeopardize the show's popularity. This internal struggle wasn't new. Throughout its run, the Jeffersons had faced similar battles, but this time felt different. The cultural climate was changing, and the appetite for risk-taking television wasn't what it had been in the 1970s. Still, the team pressed on, convinced that they could deliver a storyline that was both impactful and entertaining. The result was an episode that would go down in history, not for its brilliance, but for the controversy it ignited. What began as a bold attempt to address a pressing social issue quickly spiraled into a media firestorm. Critics were divided, audiences were vocal, and the network found itself in an uncomfortable position. The fallout from this single episode would prove to be a turning point, not just for the Jeffersons, but for television as a whole. For now, though, the show continued to air, its characters navigating their fictional world with the same wit and resilience that had endeared them to millions. Yet the shadow of what was to come loomed large, hinting at the challenges that lay ahead. The tension that had been brewing behind the scenes of the Jeffersons finally came to a head in the early 1980s. The show was still a beloved staple on television, but cracks in its foundation were becoming more visible. Creative disagreements, shifting audience expectations, and network apprehensions all converged on a single episode, one that would come to define the latter years of the show and ultimately contribute to its downfall. The episode in question was meant to be a bold statement, tackling an issue that was both timely and controversial. It wasn't unusual for the Jeffersons to address difficult topics. After all, the show had built its reputation on balancing humor with thought-provoking social commentary. But this time, the stakes felt higher. The storyline was designed to push boundaries, challenging not only the characters within the show but also the audience watching at home. The subject matter was sensitive, and while some saw it as an opportunity to spark meaningful dialogue, others worried it was a step too far. The premise of the episode centered on George Jefferson's confrontation with a deeply ingrained societal issue, one that struck at the core of his character's beliefs and experiences. The script called for George to face an ethical dilemma, one that forced him to examine his biases and question his own actions. For Sherman Hemsley, the episode was an opportunity to showcase George's complexity, peeling back the layers of his abrasive exterior to reveal the vulnerabilities beneath. But the execution of the episode proved to be far more contentious than anyone anticipated. During the initial table reads, tensions flared between cast members and the creative team. Sherman Hemsley, who was known for his dedication to the role, voiced concerns about certain lines in the script. He felt that some of the dialogue leaned too heavily on outdated stereotypes, undermining the nuanced portrayal of George Jefferson that had been cultivated over the years. Isabel Sanford, ever the diplomat, tried to mediate the discussions, but it was clear that not everyone was on the same page. The network, too, had its reservations. Executives worried about how the episode would be received by viewers and advertisers alike. The Jeffersons had always walked a fine line, but this time the risk felt greater. There were heated debates about whether certain scenes should be cut or rewritten, with the creative team pushing back against what they saw as censorship. For Norman Lear, the show's creator, the episode represented the very ethos of the Jeffersons: fearless, unflinching, and unapologetically honest. But the network's apprehension couldn't be ignored. As the production moved forward, the cast and crew found themselves under immense pressure. Filming was tense, with disagreements spilling over onto the set. Sherman Hemsley, in particular, struggled with the direction the episode was taking. He believed in the importance of addressing difficult subjects, but felt that the script lacked the subtlety and balance that had defined the show's earlier seasons. His frustration was evident, and it affected his performance during rehearsals. At times, he intentionally flubbed his lines, a quiet form of protest against what he perceived as creative missteps. When the episode finally aired, the reaction was immediate and intense. Viewers flooded CBS with phone calls and letters, expressing both praise and outrage. For some, the episode was a brave and necessary exploration of a critical issue. For others, it was an uncomfortable departure from the show's usual tone, crossing a line that many believed should have remained intact. Critics were similarly divided, with some lauding the episode's boldness and others criticizing it as heavy-handed and divisive. The backlash wasn't limited to the audience. Advertisers, a crucial lifeline for any television show, expressed their discomfort with the episode's content. Some threatened to pull their sponsorships, putting additional strain on an already uneasy relationship between the network and the show's creative team. CBS, caught in the middle, began to question whether The Jeffersons was worth the trouble. Ratings had dipped slightly in recent years, and while the show still had a loyal following, the controversy surrounding this episode made it a liability in the eyes of some executives. For the cast, the fallout was deeply personal. Sherman Hemsley and Isabel Sanford were particularly affected, as their performances had been at the center of the storm. Hemsley, who had poured so much of himself into the role of George Jefferson, felt disheartened by the reaction. He believed that the episode's message had been lost in the noise, overshadowed by the controversy it had sparked. Sanford, ever gracious, tried to maintain a sense of optimism, but even she couldn't ignore the writing on the wall. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. The creative team faced mounting pressure to steer the show in a safer direction, a prospect that didn't sit well with Norman Lear. For Lear, compromising the show's integrity was not an option. But the network's influence was hard to ignore, and the tension between creative freedom and commercial interests became an ongoing battle. The aftermath of the episode marked a turning point for the Jeffersons. While it continued to air for a few more seasons, the show was never quite the same. The controversy had left a lasting impression, both on the people who made it and the audience who watched it. George Jefferson, once a symbol of resilience and ambition, had become a lightning rod for debate, his character's complexity overshadowed by the fallout from that single episode. As the 1980s wore on, the cultural and political climate continued to shift. Audiences became more conservative, and television networks grew increasingly cautious about the content they aired. For a show like The Jeffersons, which had always thrived on pushing boundaries, this shift posed a significant challenge. The infamous episode, once seen as a bold statement, became a symbol of the risks associated with tackling controversial issues in primetime television. By the time the dust settled, it was clear that The Jeffersons had reached a turning point. The show's legacy was secure, but its future was uncertain. The characters who had brought so much laughter and insight into people's lives were now navigating a world that seemed less willing to embrace their brand of fearless storytelling. For George and Louise Jefferson, the climb to the top had been hard-fought, but staying there would prove even harder. The fallout from the controversial episode reverberated through the world of the Jeffersons, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that was impossible to ignore. While the show continued to air, the tension between the creative team, the cast, and the network became more pronounced. What had once been a harmonious balance between bold storytelling and mass appeal now felt precarious, as though the foundation on which the show had been built was beginning to crack. For Sherman Hemsley, the controversy surrounding the episode was particularly disheartening. He had always viewed George Jefferson as a character with layers, a man whose brashness and bravado masked a deeper vulnerability shaped by his experiences with racism and adversity. To see that complexity reduced to a polarizing moment was difficult to accept. Hemsley began to feel increasingly alienated on set, often retreating between takes to avoid the mounting stress. Despite his professionalism, it was clear that the weight of the controversy had taken its toll. Isabel Sanford, meanwhile, remained a calming presence, both on and off the set. As Louise Jefferson, she had become the heart of the show, grounding George's fiery temperament with her steady wisdom. But even Sanford couldn't escape the growing unease. She had always believed in the show's mission to tackle tough issues, but the backlash to the infamous episode left her questioning how much longer they could maintain that balance. Still, she approached each scene with the same grace and warmth that had endeared her to audiences for years. The network's response to the controversy was swift and decisive. Executives, wary of further backlash, began imposing stricter guidelines on the show's content. Scripts were scrutinized more closely, and storylines that might have been greenlit in earlier seasons were now met with hesitation. For Norman Lear, this was a bitter pill to swallow. He had built his career on creating television that challenged the status quo, and the restrictions placed on the Jeffersons felt like a betrayal of that vision. The shift in creative freedom was felt across the cast and crew. Writers struggled to find ways to keep the show fresh and engaging within the new constraints. Episodes that once delved fearlessly into social issues were now toned down, opting for safer, more conventional storylines. While the humor and heart of the Jeffersons remained intact, there was a noticeable change in its tone, a softening that some fans found disappointing. Despite these challenges, the Jeffersons continued to hold a special place in the hearts of its audience. The characters had become iconic, and their stories resonated deeply with viewers who saw themselves reflected in the Jeffersons' triumphs and struggles. Even as the show navigated its new limitations, it managed to deliver moments of brilliance, reminding audiences why they had fallen in love with the series in the first place. But behind the scenes, the tension was becoming harder to ignore. Sherman Hemsley's frustration with the creative direction of the show grew more pronounced. He was particularly vocal about the need to retire certain outdated elements of George Jefferson's character, including the frequent use of racial slurs and stereotypes. For Hemsley, these elements felt increasingly out of step with the progress the show had worked so hard to promote. His stance led to clashes with the writers, who were divided on whether such changes would dilute the character's essence. These disagreements created a rift that was difficult to bridge. Hemsley's quiet protests, delivering lines softly or intentionally stumbling over dialogue, became a form of resistance against what he saw as a refusal to adapt. While his actions were subtle, they sent a clear message. George Jefferson needed to evolve, just as the world around him was evolving. For some on the production team, this resistance was seen as disruptive. For others, it was a reminder of the integrity that had made Hemsley such a powerful performer. As the 1980s progressed, the cultural and political landscape continued to shift. The rise of conservatism in America brought with it a desire for television that was lighthearted and uncontroversial. Sitcoms that embraced escapism and avoided difficult subjects were gaining popularity, and the Jeffersons found itself increasingly at odds with the prevailing trends. Ratings, while still respectable, began to decline, and the network grew more hesitant to take risks with the show. By 1985, the writing was on the wall. After 11 seasons and over 250 episodes, The Jeffersons was nearing the end of its journey. The cast, while aware of the challenges facing the show, were unprepared for the abruptness with which it would come to a close. CBS's decision to cancel the series came without warning, leaving the cast and crew blindsided. Sherman Hemsley discovered the news through a newspaper article, while Isabel Sanford learned of it secondhand from a family member. The lack of communication from the network felt like a slap in the face to those who had dedicated over a decade to the show. For fans, the sudden cancellation was equally shocking. There was no grand finale, no opportunity to say goodbye to the characters they had come to love. The final episode, Red Robins, aired without any indication that it would be the last. The abruptness of the show's ending left a void, one that was felt by viewers and cast members alike. In the years that followed, the cast reflected on the legacy of the Jeffersons with a mix of pride and sadness. While the cancellation was a painful chapter, it couldn't erase the impact the show had made. George and Louise Jefferson had broken barriers, offering a portrayal of Black success that was both aspirational and deeply human. The show's willingness to tackle difficult subjects, even at the cost of controversy, had set a precedent for television that would influence generations to come. Though its time on air had ended, the spirit of the Jeffersons lived on. Characters like George and Louise made guest appearances on other shows, including a memorable cameo in the final episode of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. In 2019, the show was honored with a live special, bringing its iconic moments back to life for a new generation. For Sherman Hemsley, Isabel Sanford, and the rest of the cast, these tributes were a testament to the enduring power of the story they had told. As the doors to the Jeffersons' Manhattan apartment closed for the last time, their legacy remained intact. They had faced the challenges of their time with courage, humor, and heart, leaving behind a blueprint for what television could be when it dared to push boundaries. Yet, the memory of that infamous episode lingered, a reminder of the delicate balance between storytelling and controversy, and the high price that sometimes came with it. In the years since its cancellation, The Jeffersons has remained a cornerstone of television history, a show that dared to reflect the complexities of race, class, and ambition in America. While the abrupt ending left unanswered questions, the impact of its 11-season run is undeniable. It wasn't just a sitcom, it was a cultural milestone, one that paved the way for future portrayals of African American success on television. The legacy of the Jeffersons is built on its ability to challenge societal norms while still making people laugh. It presented a vision of Black upward mobility at a time when such portrayals were scarce. George and Louise Jefferson weren't just characters, they were symbols of perseverance, resilience, and the pursuit of the American dream. Their journey resonated with audiences who saw themselves reflected in the triumphs and struggles of the Jefferson family. After the show ended, the cast members carried the spirit of the Jeffersons into their future endeavors. Sherman Hemsley, forever associated with the iconic George Jefferson, went on to star in other sitcoms like Amen, where he brought his signature blend of humor and gravitas to a new role. Despite his success, Hemsley often spoke about the lasting influence of George Jefferson, a character that remained close to his heart until his passing in 2012. Isabel Sanford, who played the indomitable Louise Jefferson, also left an indelible mark on the entertainment industry. Her portrayal of Louise earned her an Emmy Award, making her the first African-American actress to win in the category of Outstanding Lead Actress in a comedy series. This achievement was more than a personal victory. It was a moment of recognition for the significance of the Jeffersons in shaping television history. Sanford continued acting until her passing in 2004, but Louise Jefferson remained her most celebrated role, a testament to her ability to bring warmth, strength, and wisdom to the screen. Other cast members, like Marla Gibbs, who played the sharp-tongued housekeeper Florence Johnston, continued to thrive in the industry. Gibbs, whose comedic timing and sass made her a fan favorite, transitioned seamlessly into other roles, demonstrating her versatility as an actress. She also became an advocate for preserving the cultural legacy of the Jeffersons, ensuring that its contributions to television were not forgotten. The show's influence extended far beyond its cast. The Jeffersons opened doors for future television programs that centered on African-American families, from The Cosby Show to Blackish. It demonstrated that stories about Black success could resonate with diverse audiences and that representation mattered, not just in the characters on screen, but in the narratives they embodied. By portraying the Jeffersons as multidimensional individuals navigating a complex world, the show challenged stereotypes and expanded the possibilities for what television could achieve. The infamous episode that contributed to the show's end remains a topic of discussion among fans and scholars alike. While some view it as a misstep, others see it as a bold, albeit controversial, attempt to tackle a difficult issue. In retrospect, it serves as a reminder of the challenges faced by shows that strive to push boundaries. The episode's legacy is intertwined with that of the show itself, a reflection of its willingness to take risks, even when the outcome was uncertain. In 2019, the legacy of the Jeffersons was celebrated in a live television special produced by Norman Lear and Jimmy Kimmel. Featuring an all-star cast including Jamie Foxx as George Jefferson and Wanda Sykes as Louise, the special reintroduced the show to a new generation of viewers. It was a nostalgic yet forward-looking tribute, highlighting the timeless themes of the Jeffersons while honoring the original cast and their contributions. For fans, it was a chance to revisit the moments that made the show so special, while newcomers were introduced to the wit, charm, and cultural relevance that defined it. The enduring popularity of the Jeffersons is perhaps best exemplified by its theme song, "Movin' On Up." Written by Jeanette Dubois and Jeff Barry, the song has become an anthem for aspiration and success. Its infectious melody and uplifting lyrics capture the essence of the Jeffersons' journey, and it continues to be a cultural touchstone, often referenced in movies, television, and music. The theme song is more than just a piece of nostalgia. It's a celebration of perseverance and the joy of achieving one's dreams. While the show's cancellation may have felt abrupt, its impact has stood the test of time. The Jeffersons remains a case study in how television can entertain while also sparking meaningful conversations. It wasn't afraid to tackle uncomfortable topics, and in doing so, it left a lasting imprint on the industry. The show's success proved that diversity in storytelling isn't just a moral imperative, it's also good business. By bringing the Jeffersons story to life, Norman Lear and his team demonstrated the power of representation and the importance of telling stories that reflect the full spectrum of human experience. Today, the Jeffersons is remembered not just for its humor, but for its heart. Its characters were more than archetypes. They were people with hopes, fears, and dreams that resonated with audiences across racial and generational divides. The show's ability to balance comedy with commentary is a testament to the talent of its cast and creators, who dared to believe that television could be both entertaining and enlightening. The infamous moment that led to the Jeffersons' cancellation may have cast a shadow on its final years, but it also highlighted the show's courage. It served as a reminder that progress often comes with challenges, and that pushing boundaries is rarely without controversy. Yet the Jeffersons' story remains a testament to the idea that those challenges are worth facing. As time passes, the Jeffersons continue to inspire. It stands as a reminder of what television can achieve when it dares to reflect the world as it is and as it could be. George and Louise Jefferson may have closed the door to their Manhattan apartment, but their story lives on, moving upward and onward in the hearts of those who continue to celebrate their journey. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.